He was born in Connecticut in 1826. His mother died when he was young, and his father raised him and homeschooled him until he went off to university to Yale. After college, he attended Yale Divinity School and then went on to attend Union Theological Seminary in New York City. In 1849, Charles Loring Bracy was ordained as a congregational minister. After graduation, he and some of his friends decided to go on a little holiday over to Europe, and they traveled around to some of the correctional institutions and the philanthropic institutions. And while he was on his tour, he decided that he was being called to serve more in the missionary field, to serve the poor than to serve a parish. And so when he came back to the United States, he found a position as the assistant to the Reverend Lewis Peace, a Methodist minister at the Five Points Mission, which was a mission that was part of the Bowery area in Manhattan, one of the worst slums in America in the 1850s. He also was a bit of a journalist. He wrote an article entitled "Walks Among the New York Poor," and that was published in the New York Times. And people over the next many years would read about the adventures of what he discovered, but about the poverty and vice on the streets of New York. Reverend Bracy decided, working with the poor, that he wanted to concentrate his efforts on the children because he felt like there was better hope to reach out to the children, because at that time, unlike today, there wasn't any mechanism to keep kids off the street. And so children were living on the street, and either because they were immigrant children or their parents kicked them out, or there wasn't a home life to go to. And so they were often called by the police street Arabs or street rats because of all the activities that they got into. And so in 1857, he and several other ministers created the Children's Aid Society, and he was appointed as the director, which he served until his death in 1890. And they did many progressive things like start far-reaching services for the homeless children, for working women, for needy families, disabled boys and girls at the time who needed services. And they found lodging for housing for thousands of boys that were selling newspapers on the street, and industrial schools to teach a trade, and a farm school, and even summer homes on Long Island. But probably the thing that Reverend Bracy is remembered for the most was the orphan train. Have you ever heard of the orphan train? It was the idea that life would be better out in the countryside because they had this idea that out on the farm things were better. And so in 1856, he took 64 kids with a guardian and loaded them up on a train and sent them off to Michigan, and went to a meeting of a church, and the guardian explained that these were homeless kids that needed a home. And all the children were adopted and began to live on the farm. The orphan train survived Reverend Bracy. It lasted for 75 years, till 1929. And over 100,000 children were placed in this way, some of which went on to become governors of a state, a congressman, and a Supreme Court justice. All because one man felt called to serve and to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. Well, today we get to the end of our sermon series on following the way. And if you remember way back in September, on September 7th, we started to walk this way. And we invited us to ponder what it meant to be a follower of Jesus and how to be a disciple of Christ. And all along the way, we've talked about how we are commissioned to invite others to be disciples and to be fishers of people. And if you recall, Barbara and I have spent a lot of time talking about prayer and how to pray and how to have a more personal relationship with God. And we've talked about things like mercy and grace and forgiveness and loving enemy. And most of all, how to love. For we reminded ourselves that in the Bible, love is more than a feeling. It's an attitude. It's an attitude of compassion and care for our fellow human being. And we've spent time inviting us to continue to ever keep expanding what that circle of care looks like. And so we spent all this time talking about how Jesus inspires us to be full of gratitude, full of compassion, full of care. And so I appreciate you taking this journey with us, and I hope it has informed us about our faith. And now today, we take one last step. The invitation to serve. We're called to be serving people. You heard it in our scripture lesson today. Very strange passage of scripture. Remember how I told you it was written some 50 years after Jesus? And so it was a way to hold up to the current Christian leaders, hey, remember those guys back there that we didn't like what they were doing? Don't do that. You're called to serve. You're called to humble yourself. You're called to the first to be last and the last to be first. And so we're invited to live that. Dr. Martin Luther King reminded us in his famous speech, The Drum Major Instinct, if you want to be important, wonderful. If you want to be recognized, wonderful. If you want to be great, wonderful. But recognize that he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. That's the new definition of greatness. And it goes on to talk about how we can all be as smart as we want to be and we can do great things. But when it comes to serving, all we need is a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love, and you can be that servant. So today, we are invited to serve. But that's a problem, isn't it? Because in our society, the greatest is not to serve, but to be served. That's what's supposed to happen. You know, we're supposed to be so successful that other people serve us. So why did Jesus call us to serve? Just as our young person here, when it comes to the baptism, he said, well, why? Why? Because Jesus understood that when we all had a serving heart, it leads to a just and fair society. When all understand they are to serve, the world is a better place. Well, how can that be? Well, let me tell you how you can do that. For those of you who are in a committed relationship, it means that each of us are called to serve in that relationship. So to me, what that means is it's a competition. Who can serve the most? I'm talking to you guys now. A healthy, vibrant relationship is when each person does their part to help the other person, to serve. That's a healthy relationship. So we start there. And then it comes to our places of business. And here it gets to be a little problematic because all of us know if we're willing to serve, there are other people who are willing to let us. And so my advice in that area is be part of a company where you understand no matter what your role is, everybody's there to serve in their role. And everybody's there to help each other out. And if that's not happening, maybe that's not the place to work. Service is about saying we're all called to serve and help each other. That's following the way. Now, Thursday, we're going to celebrate Thanksgiving. And that's a big day for us in the United Church of Christ because we get to claim the pilgrims. They belong to us. Because you all know the story, how the Pilgrims were separatists and came to the New World, and they hooked up with the Puritans, and they all joined together and became good Congregationalists. And then the United Church of Christ. So they're us. And we know that the Pilgrims came here to start a new life because they wanted to worship and practice their faith the way they chose. But we also know that it didn't quite work out too well for them in the beginning because by the time they got here, it was November, and they ended up in Massachusetts instead of Virginia. And of the 100 people in their group, half died the first winter. But you know how the story goes, how they were befriended by the native population who showed them how to hunt and how to plant crops and how to fish. And so that when they brought the harvest in the fall and their hunting party, it had a particularly good hunting expedition, they decided to give thanks because they were Christians, and that's what you do. When you're thankful, you give thanks. And so they decided to have a party. And so they invited the native population to join them, who understood that when you come to a party, you bring food. And so they brought all these deer and all these other things, and they partied for 3 days. And I like to tell that story about the Puritans because John C. Miller, in his book, The First Frontier, Life in Colonial America, also reminds us that the following year after the first year that the Pilgrims were there, the same company that sponsored the Pilgrims sponsored another colony that moved nearby, who was not a religious group, who came for profit. And the first thing they did was to start to quarrel among themselves because they couldn't get along, and they alienated the native population to the place that the Pilgrims had to step in to save them before they got massacred. And after they were here for a little over a year, they all went back to England. 2 years later, when a ship came to where the Pilgrims were, and they invited anyone who wanted to go back to England, nobody left. They all stayed. And for me, that's a microcosm of what's going on in America right now. Because we sort of get this idea that we're all in this just for ourselves and don't think about anybody else. And we'll be just like that group that split into chaos. Because our faith teaches us that it's about me and you and God. And when we do that, we realize that we're invited, we're all in this together. Come on in, guys. Go find your mom. Keep going. That's right. She's way back there, right back there. And so as we have this last day of following the way, we realize that we're here to have an attitude of gratitude, an attitude of compassion, and an attitude of service. Because the greatest among us are those who serve. So what are you doing to serve? Is it enough? What can you do now to help your brother and your sister and those in need? Won't you let me be your servant? Let me be as Christ to you. Pray that I may have the grace to let you be my servant too.